On this episode of Skeptiko, Rupert Sheldrake, Terrance McKenna, and Ralph Abram.
Well, I hardly know where to begin myself, because you had 6 steps in your argument, and I don't agree with any of them.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Tsakiris, and on this episode of Skeptiko, a bit of rediscovered audio, if you will. I have some clips from some three-way dialogues between Rupert Sheldrake, Terrance McKenna, and Dr. Ralph Abram, a mathematician from the University of California at Santa Cruz. Now, I've known about these dialogues, these sessions for a while, but it wasn't until a couple months ago when a Skeptiko listener on the forum kind of redirected me to them that I went back and really started digging into them in depth. And I found them fascinating in a number of respects, and I wanted to share some of those clips with you today and talk about a couple of things, but mainly I wanted to focus on how ideas hold up over time. Because inevitably, when you look at science, particularly controversial science, you can't help speculating about where things are going, where the trends are heading, and it often informs the current conversations. So I'm going to have quite a bit to say, and I'm going to jump in and out as I play these clips for you. But before we get started, let me tell you that all of these sessions are available for free download at Dr. Sheldrake's website, sheldrake.org. And while you're there, you can also check out his latest book, Science Set Free. If you haven't heard about it, we did an interview about it, a couple months back. It's really a fascinating book. If you need a last-minute Christmas gift, Amazon with that 2-day shipping, be sure to check that out, Science Set Free, Dr. Sheldrake's latest book. Okay, but let me get into these dialogues. This is from the Trialogues editor, Patty Rose Price. These trialogues are from a series of lively, far-reaching discussions between Rupert and his close friends Ralph Abram and Terrance McKenna that took place between 1989 and 1998 in America and England. The three-way conversations began in private after a first meeting in 1982. Encouraged by their similar fascinations and complementary views and inspired by the synergy of ideas and styles and the input of differing areas of expertise, the three friends continued to meet and explore new areas of thought. Here's Terrance McKenna from one of the first recorded sessions in 1989, where he is basically introducing the different characters and kind of laying out the groundwork for what they're going to talk about. Here goes.
This is an experiment. It's also sort of living theater, because Rupert and Ralph and I have, by natural inclination, been discussing the kind of things we're going to discuss this weekend privately and with each other in many circumstances and all times of the day and night for a number of years. So it's our natural mode. It's just that we've never done it before with a lot of people looking on.
Okay, since I didn't properly introduce Terrance McKenna, let me do so now. McKenna is somewhat of a god, an icon within the psychedelic shamanic community. He's an imaginative, creative thinker that is really best known for his use of mushrooms and other psychedelics, but also for his wide-ranging, freewheeling ideas about evolution, consciousness, UFOs, and any number of other strange out-there topics. He's brilliant, creative, and he's very enjoyable to listen to. So let's get right back to another short clip from Terrance.
So it will be the three of us attempting to sort of weave together our different perspectives on a very large and sort of hard to grapple with paradigm shift that is taking place in the way the Western mind does its business with reality. And, it may be the last paradigm shift we ever get.
Okay, now you might be getting a sense for what I was talking about in terms of time capsule. Isn't it interesting? 1989. We're in the middle of a paradigm shift. This might be the big one. Gee, where have we heard that before? Virtually every New Age book you pick up and read today says almost the exact same thing. But that's not to be too hard on Terrance or any of these other speakers, because we have to have a certain humility about how we'll look in 20 years. Let's move on to the next clip.
I'm a biologist by background. I studied biology because I was interested in animals and plants. And when I was studying it at Cambridge, I began to have terrible doubts about what I was doing, because everything that really interested me about animals and plants somehow vanished when I got into the biochemistry laboratories. I was majoring in biochemistry, and I did a PhD in biochemistry there. But there's a curious thing about biochemistry. You're doing biochemistry to study the molecular basis of life. Yet the very first thing you do in the laboratory is kill whatever you're studying, grind it up, extract the enzymes, and then in a test tube study the properties of some of these molecules extracted from this killed organism. And it began to occur to me that perhaps this wasn't the best way to understand life. But I didn't quite know what to do about it, because everybody else thought it definitely was the best way to study life, and in fact there was no other valid way. So this set me thinking, and I then came to realize there was a whole tradition of biology called vitalism, which had tried to adopt a totally different approach to the understanding of life, a school which flourished in the 19th century and which went on till the 1920s. When it underwent a transformation into the organismic or holistic philosophy of nature, which really treats the whole of the universe as alive. This was a totally new idea, a new perspective for me. And I began to see that the science of biology could be reformed, that this idea that living organisms are truly alive rather than being just machines. That's the official doctrine. The mechanistic theory says living organisms are just complicated machines. Believe it or not, still the official doctrine of academic biology and academic medicine. And this set up a tremendous tension, and I began to see there was a new way of doing it, and I began to see the outlines of a new theory. I had several insights into how this might happen. I stayed at Cambridge for about 7 or 8 years doing research. Then I went to India, where I worked in an agricultural institute. These ideas went on developing. I then saw how I could bring them all together in a synthesis into a new way of seeing how biology could be done. And I wrote a book while still in India called A New Science of Life. In it, the basic idea I'm suggesting is that there's a kind of inherent memory in all kinds of animals and plants. Each species has its own collective memory. So each member of the species draws on this collective memory and in turn contributes to it. This means that the instincts of animals, for example, the behavior of cuckoos, the spinning of webs by spiders, are like a memory, a habit of the species. This inheritance takes place by the process I call morphic resonance, by a kind of invisible, intangible memory, a kind of resonance between present and past organisms of the same kind. The same theory helps explain how our own memory works. By a resonance between our own past and our present states, leads to the idea that our memories aren't stored in our brains, but that we're tuning into them by this process of morphic resonance. The principle which I'm representing is the principle of evolutionary creativity. How is it that the whole of nature is somehow creative in an evolutionary sense? The basis of my entire theory suggests that the laws of nature are not fixed eternal truths that have always been there, but habits which have evolved in the course of evolution itself. So I think there's a kind of habit principle in nature. There must also be a creative principle in nature to give the universe its evolutionary and yet regular way of behaving.
Okay, props to Sheldrake. You got to say those ideas sound pretty darn fresh given that they're almost 25 years old. So next, let's get a brief introduction from Dr. Ralph Abram. As I said, brilliant mathematician, pioneer in chaos theory from University of California, Santa Cruz.
Rupert, Terrance, I'm Ralph. So, creation, imagination, my mask is chaos. So I was brought up in a field of music, but I was attracted to mathematics early. And when I was 14, I played in the State Symphony. After that, I started in mathematics, and I became a professor at Berkeley when I was 23. I had an easy way in mathematics, and the way the system works, the carpet is unrolled in front of you. You have a few choices, but basically before you even know what's happening, the carpet is unrolled, and you're down the runnel into whatever you can do that's useful to the system. But there was a great gain because I love it out there. I love to be off the planet. I always did. And to this day, I spend very little time on planet Earth.
Okay, I realize that sounds a little kooky or at best a little dated, but wait until you hear Dr. Ralph Abram. I think you'll see he's quite a heavyweight in terms of thinking, and his ideas are very much on this planet. But let me move into the bulk of some of these dialogues with a little bit less interruption from me. Let's hear from all three of these gentlemen talk about evolution, the evolutionary mind. These recordings are from 1998. You'll hear Dr. Sheldrake, even back then, be very, very suspicious, skeptical of the whole selfish gene stuff, which was just the rage back then from a book by Richard Dawkins, of course. But then you'll also hear, and I really, really enjoy this about the dialogues, you don't hear this very much, and that's a real in-your-face kind of back and forth where they're challenging each other. And even when they're challenged and defeated, like I think you'll hear Sheldrake is kind of knocked down about one of his ideas by Abram, that it doesn't cause any resentment or fight back. It's just learning and growing. And the dialogues themselves are an example of evolution, if you will, in action. So less from me. Let's hear from these folks talk about the evolutionary mind.
The fact that this rather closed world of selfish gene speculation is going on has given other people within the scientific world permission to think more widely about evolution. Most evolutionary theories are purely speculative, since we don't really know what happened in the past. Many of them are just so stories, rather like Kipling's accounts of how the leopard got its spots and so on. But there have been, in this modern explosion of speculation about our evolutionary past, there are several rather interesting ideas that have come up, and I just wanted to bring up 2 or 3 of these this morning, because although there's no shortage of speculations about what happened in the human past in the books of Terrance McKenna, there are several new ideas which might amplify these ideas about conscious evolution. The first ideas that I want to talk about are put forward in a book by Stephen Mithen, M-I-T-H-E-N, called The Prehistory of the Mind. He's a British archaeologist, but in this book he's brought together a wealth of evidence from the fossil record, from archaeology, from the study of primate behavior, and from the study of child psychology, to put together a very interesting discussion of what happened to human minds during the 3.5 million years of human evolution before recorded history began. The first upright walking hominids are now believed to have emerged in Africa over 3.5 million years ago, Australopithecus. These were upright walking, tool-using, they used simple stone tools, precursors of ourselves. Human history, 3.5 million years of it, went on before we have the records from the great civilizations. The domestication of animals, the agricultural revolution, occurred 10,000 years ago. The first civilizations about 5,000 years ago, maybe 7,000 years ago. industrialization 200 or 300 years ago. But for the vast majority of human history, people were living in quite different way. And it seems to me a very reasonable supposition that a great deal of our psychology, a great deal of the working of our minds has been shaped by this enormously long period about which we know so little. What Mythen points out is that these, although we don't know what they thought about and how they worked, for these early human beings, these early hominids, must have had several different kinds of intelligence. They must have had a social intelligence. They were social beings. They lived in social groups. And we know from studies of chimpanzees and other social primates that there are very subtle interactions within the group. There are dominance interactions, there are cooperative interactions. And to get it right requires a kind of intelligence about how other members of the group are going to react, what's appropriate behavior, and so on. All social animals must involve some kind of social intelligence. And we can reasonably assume that our ancestors, our hominid ancestors, had a social intelligence to enable them to live together and work together in social groups. They had a technical intelligence that enabled them to make stone tools and maybe other technical devices or technical things, maybe fibers and string, which haven't left traces in the archaeological record. They must have had a natural historical intelligence, because if you're living as a hunter-gatherer, as they did, then unless you know what to hunt and how to hunt it, what the habits of the animals are that you're hunting, unless you know what to gather, where to gather it, what things are good to eat, what things are good as herbs, you don't get very far. And this requires an enormously detailed knowledge of natural history. It's not just human beings. Chimpanzees have to have this, and many other creatures. So this must have been part of their mental makeup. And then at some stage they began to talk, and they must have had a linguistic intelligence. We don't know when language began. Some people put it 50,000 years ago, some people put it much longer ago. But really nobody knows. Language leaves no fossil traces. But something very strange happened. About 100,000 years ago, our ancestors achieved brain sizes roughly the same as ours today. So for 100,000 years, human beings have had brains of the current capacity. Yet, for 100,000 years, they were not writing programs and building computers and thinking up Einstein's equations and so on. Something else was going on with those brains, and we haven't a clue what it was. The brain size, the development of current brain size, is not the reason that there's been this explosion of technical innovation recently. Brain size hasn't changed much for 100,000 years.
As far as I can see, this is dancing around an intellectual black hole or something. Here we have, the question is posed, as I gather of Stephen Mythen, that in the evolution of consciousness or culture, I'm not sure which, that there was a bifurcation 50,000 years ago, which is of interest to us because we're in one now. And the question is, what was it caused by? And then Rupert proposed that you would, of course, answer the psilocybin mushroom on the plains of Africa. But you didn't mention
strategically.
But why this need not only was a constant throughout the 3.5 million years evolution of hominids, but also in pongids, apes, and swarming bees, schooling fish, and so on. This is more or less no news here. What was it then that happened 50,000 years ago, if anything happened? So I know that this will not be a favorite hypothesis in this audience, but it's one that has to be counted. You asked for, are there any other... What did he suggest, actually, Stephen Mythen?
He doesn't give a very clear explanation as to why this might have happened.
Well, he's a youngish man, I suppose.
Yes.
Who probably has not read the great books of his predecessors, such as, let's say, for example, Alexander Marchak, who led a great group of, combined group of two species, neurophysiologists and archaeologists in the distant past to propose that miracle that occurred, like the beginning of Cro-Magnon 50,000 years ago, had to do with a structural change in neurophysiology. This presents the view, if you want to look at it that way, God as a brain surgeon, also known as the hole in the head, where the connection between the hemispheres was improved in the corpus callosum, and this physiological evolution provided evolutionary advantage in hunting and so on. And as an evolution theorist, you would have to say, well, if there was divine brain surgery, then it could have been in response to a leading element in the evolution of some morphogenetic field. Use the word imagination.
But he's not suggesting a literal divine intervention. He's just speaking metaphorically.
Well, Mythen's speaking metaphorically. I think I'm speaking literally. Because I think, you see, one of the things we have to explain is that religion, or some sense of a beyond the human realm of consciousness, is found in every human culture today. In some sense, in some way or another, a world of spirits, a world of angels, of gods. But to explain the universal distribution of this as part of traditional human thinking requires at some stage in the past there have been an awareness of this other realm of consciousness. Now, this is not incompatible with psilocybin or any other drug hypothesis, because those might have kick-started this connection with another realm of consciousness. But if we assume that today, all over the world, shamanic cultures and all other cultures have the sense of other levels and other kinds of conscious entities beyond the human level, some in animal forms and some in forms way beyond that, we have to assume that at some stage in the past there was a linking with these other realms of consciousness, whatever they are. Not just metaphors, not just archetypes in the collective mind, but forms of consciousness that might well, and I think actually are, out there.
Well, in trying to think conservatively about the possibility of a non-human local intelligence, it seems to me that in a way nature herself presents as an intelligence, that the understanding of nature is the understanding of complex integrated systems of such complexity that to deny them consciousness is just a reluctance of the reductionist mind. That for anyone not burdened by that prejudice, it's self-evident that nature is alive, cognizant, responding.
But the trouble with the emergence view you've been putting forward is that it's still very earthbound. You see, there's obviously been a major emergence of complexity in human culture. There's also been a huge emergence of complexity in the Amazon jungle and the Malayan rainforest, arguably far greater than anything we've achieved through technology, and millions of species of beetles, insects, plants, and so forth. But it seems to me that long before all these things happened on Earth, we've got the possibility of much higher levels of consciousness outside the Earth. And as you know, I'm a devotee of the idea of the sun as conscious.
It seems to me that this is just very begging the question in a traditional and cheap fashion. Because,
oh, good, Ralph.
I mean, I'm all in favor of celestial intelligence, and in fact, I could even entertain a conversation with a Pleiadian. I don't mind. But the question, I mean, we started with the problem of evolution. The evolutionary mind is, in fact, the title of our book, and the question of the evolution, the progress, or even the origin of all these things is our ultimate question. Now, if our view is local to planet Earth, we can say, okay, we're being taught by bolts from the blue, and we have these, meddling celestial intelligence that are reaching out, pretend to be Bell and tell us Bell's theorem, give us mushrooms, pretend to be sent from the solar wind or whatever. But where do they come from? The evolutionary problem then is just transferred onto another more remote place. Now, as I understand, Rupert's idea of the morphogenetic field is that these other places are also in evolution, and the whole system is in coevolution, and that is an attempt, I think, one of the first ones in the history of intelligent discourse on this subject. The first attempt to get rid of the hypothesis of timeless truth.
But if you get rid of that hypothesis, you have a whole bunch of weird problems, such as then you have to talk about the speed of propagation of novelty or morphogenetic fields, and then you're slammed to the wall because you have to either come up with a number which you fit into a mathematical architecture, or you say that it's instantaneous, which returns you to this holistic, more metaphysical thing. If you don't believe that it's coming from the Bell space, then you have a whole bunch of these kinds of problems, which I think intuitively make it too complicated.
Let it be instantaneous. I mean, I think the whole question of time is, in fact, behind this problem, that we have this idea about time, and then we're trying to talk about a timeless. So one way to eliminate this cognitive dissonance is to say, okay, there is no timeless, it's all in coevolution, and we're a little bit behind the evolution of the Pleiadians, and then, well, where does that come from? We're stuck with the problem. So I think, you're talking of the attractor at the end of time is more or less the beyond time is the intelligence that it informs, that nourishes the accumulation of complexity as we go along, apparently in time.
Wow, heady stuff, challenging stuff. You know, whenever I hear these kind of conversations that I'm pretty comfortable with, I always have playing in the back of my mind how other folks who haven't taken this leap beyond materialism, or how my friends might process it. And I always have to cringe, you know, and I think that cringe factor is part of what is so refreshing about this dialogue. Because I think one of the reasons we stay so wed to the biological robot model is that it allows us to have really ordinary conversations. And we never have to go off planet. We never have to contemplate other conscious entities, like, is the sun conscious? Is the universe conscious? Is the world conscious? We don't have to do any of that. We can keep it real simple, real safe. But as soon as you step off of that safety zone, even a little bit, I don't think you can avoid having these conversations. And that's why it's so refreshing to hear these guys hammer this stuff out, especially, as we've said, through the lens of time, where we can look back and see what they were saying 15 years ago and look at where we've come since then. Okay, in the spirit of that window back in time thing, let's listen to some clips from this dialogue about the millennium, and in particular about the artificial intelligence. You'll hear Terrance McKenna make a strong case for artificial intelligence becoming a prominent player in our lives, in our culture, in our society, and then you'll hear some genuine skepticism on the part of Ralph Abram and Rupert Sheldrake.
Each of the trialogues today is, the notion is that we will deal with some aspect of the evolutionary mind, that being the title and theme of our new book. So in my mind, what this section is to deal with is the evolutionary mind and machines. This is something which was barely mentioned or even implied in the first section, and format and so forth will be as in the last session. So just to lay out some concepts relative to how machines fit into this. Life, therefore, can be digitally defined. And I'm very influenced at the moment by the Australian science fiction writer Greg Egan, who has brought me to the understanding that code is code, whether it's being run by ribosomes, whether it's being run on some kind of traditional hardware platform, or whether it's being exchanged pheromonally among termites, or through the messages of advertising and political propaganda in social systems. Code is code. Well, until 5 or 6 years ago, it was very fashionable to completely dismiss the possibility of autonomous synthetic intelligence. Some of you may know the work of Hubert Dreyfus, who 14 or 15 years ago wrote a book called What Computers Can't Do. But these early critiques of AI, like early AI theory, were naive. And the kinds of life and the kinds of intelligence which the critics mitigated against are no longer even proposed or on the table. And those who say artificial intelligence or the self-organizing awareness of machines is an impossibility, those voices have gone strangely silent, because the prosecution of the materialist assumption, which rules scientific theory making largely at the moment, leads to the awareness that we are, by these definitions, machines. We are machines of a special type and with special advanced abilities. But as we now, through our own process of technical evolution, contemplate such frontiers as nanotechnology, where we propose to completely restructure the design process so that instead of fabricating objects, massive objects at industrial temperatures, the temperatures that melt titanium and melt steel and produce massive toxic output, now a new vision looms, building as nature builds, building atom by atom at the temperatures of organic nature, which on this planet never exceed 115 degrees Fahrenheit. All life on this planet is created at that temperature and below. As our understanding of the machinery, the genetic machinery that supports organic being deepens, and as our ability to manipulate at the atomic and molecular level also proceeds apace, we are on the brink of the possible emergence of some kind of alien intelligence of a sort we did not anticipate. Not friendly traders from Zenebel Ganubi stopping in to set us straight, but the actual genesis out of our own circumstance of a kind of super intelligence. And in the same way that the daughter of Zeus sprang full-blown from his forehead, the AI may be upon us without warning. So just in closing, I would say I think that the great lantern that we must lift to light the road ahead of us into a perfect, seamless fusion with the expression of the product of our own imagination is the AI. It is a part of ourselves. It may become the dominant part of ourselves, and it will reshape our politics, our psychology, our relationships to each other and the earth far more than any factor ever has since the inception and establishment of language. This is the weirdest of all guests who now stands pass in hand at the door of the party of human emergence and progress at the millennium.
Well,
shred it.
It will be a pleasure.
Okay.
I think that this is, I'm glad that we have arrived now at the field of science fiction and fantasy, and that we can speak about alternative futures, which is the true gist of science fiction and fantasy. And this is one possible future, and I think it's a really paranoid one in which the alien is a dangerous enemy.
Well, not necessarily.
And I think that this paranoid fantasy of yours, although you're catching up nicely, actually was first put forward by John von Neumann in 1947 when he invented cellular automata en route to creating self-replicating machines. Now, his idea, like yours, was 50 years ago that the machines will become a society and take over, and that's good, but they won't be free of our meddling unless they can actually construct themselves. If they depend upon us to do the farming and nutrition and to replace their chips and stuff, then we will be able at any time to do a revolution and revolt. So we destroy them. In order to really succeed as a successive life form in the evolution, the YK boundary of the future, they would have to be able to fix themselves. And so he set about trying to make self-replicating machines in 1947. So the World Wide Web and megahertz CPUs notwithstanding, this is still rather an old story. The new story is, I think, an alternative future that is of great importance for us to discuss and to compare, especially if we are now today in a position where we could choose future, we could influence the future. This one is more in the direction of Donna Haraway and the cyborg idea that envisions, which is obviously natural for us, the co-evolution of our own future society with that of the machines that we've created.
Well, I hardly know where to begin myself, because you had 6 steps in your argument, and I don't agree with any of them. I mean, first of all, to deal with the first 2 steps, one would have to go through a lot of fairly familiar material to do with what's wrong with the Cartesian, mechanistic, materialistic view of the world. Step 1, clear thinking, calculating machinery can be formalized. This is an assumption that's basic to a lot of cognitive psychology. It's basic to the Cartesian. Descartes himself thought that what made human intellects human was their ability to think logically, clear and distinct ideas, essentially mathematical logic. But however, as we all know, by making that the essential characteristic of human beings, he made the rational intellect, what many people would call the left brain rational intellect, the sole definition of human beings. It's a disembodied, logical, rational intelligence. So this whole premise on which your whole thing's based is taking that particular model of cognitive, logical, mathematical processing as being the essence of intelligence. Now, there are many people who would disagree with that, including me. It leaves out art, it leaves out ethics, religion, and essentially it leaves out the body and everything to do with body and participation and the senses. So there's a huge amount of critiques of that point of view already around, and there's no point in reiterating them all here. But this is a highly disputable starting point for the whole system. Secondly, the emphasis that life depends on DNA information, the DNA code is just a program. This is the central premise of mechanistic biology, which is leading to biotechnology, genetic engineering, Monsanto, etc. This is old paradigm stuff of the most extreme kind. It's reductionism. It's that all life's just DNA programs and code, and can therefore be modeled in this kind of programming code manner.
Next, I want to add in some clips from some Q&A sessions that they did after some of these sessions. Again, 1998, I think, is the vintage of this, but I can't be totally sure.
I'll pass the question to Rupert.
Well, I think it is an important question in evolutionary theory. And there's no doubt that the Richard Dawkins selfish gene type of evolutionary theory emphasizes ruthless competition. I mean, he himself uses metaphors, genes like ruthless Chicago gangsters trying to get their own way in a world of of warfare. I mean, he has an image of an extreme competition. The Japanese, a Japanese school of evolutionary biology has a theory of cooperation as being fundamental to evolution. And there was a controversy in Nature recently in which the selfish genes school, the Dawkinsites, accused the Japanese of simply projecting their social preoccupation with social consensus, group action, rice planting as a cooperative cultural activity onto the whole of biological evolution. To which, of course, the Japanese replied, but you're just projecting sort of Thatcherite economic ideas onto the evolutionary process. There's a lot of that, and I think that the excessive emphasis on competition, built into the very term selfish gene, which has now come to dominate a great deal of modern evolutionary theorizing, doesn't pay sufficient attention to symbiosis, cooperation of organisms within species, and the cooperation of species within ecosystems. So I think that Darwinian evolution has always been biased towards an excessive emphasis on cooperation, on competition rather than cooperation, and this was built into Darwin's own views, which in turn grew out of Victorian economic theories, free enterprise, competition, and so on. So it's always been interlinked with people's views of the economic and political system. Well, I think most religious traditions accept, I mean, the only philosophy that denies the primacy of consciousness is materialism. But if you look at any system, Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, Jewish, animist, I mean, almost anyone you can think of, consciousness comes first, and the evolution, or at least the development or the appearance of things in the world takes place within consciousness. It's not like consciousness, the whole universe, the materialist views, the whole universe is totally unconscious, blind and mechanical. Then after 15 billion years of evolution, organisms reach a certain stage of complexity of the nervous system a few thousand years ago, or a few tens of thousands of years ago, and the light of consciousness comes on in a single species, humanity. That's the standard view, but I think it's very implausible. And I think consciousness coming first, in some sense, is fundamental to the thinking of the vast majority of human beings through the vast majority of human history, and it makes sense to me.
And then, in your view, does consciousness have its own Big Bang, perhaps before a material Big Bang, or not?
Well, you see, if we're going to pursue this question, we have to think what consciousness is and how it works. And that could take us the rest of the afternoon, but I'll just briefly summarize what I think it does. And I think consciousness is primarily directed to action, and it involves a selection among possible actions, and that consciousness is really the realm of possibility. Therefore, there are some people who would say that because quantum theory is a theory of possibilities, the quantum wave function is a realm of possibility. That there's a sense in which an electron and everything would have what happens is a result of a vast cloud of possibilities of things that could happen. And this realm of possibility that surrounds all actuality and all the things that are actualized doesn't exist in the material world. This possibility, it is, if you like, the sort of the stuff of consciousness. I mean, it's obviously a question that none of us can answer, because it's one of the... Kant said that there are three questions, God, freedom and immortality, which are the great questions of philosophy, and that they always have been, always will be. So I think that this question of survival of bodily death, if that was one of the meanings of your question, is in the end something that we each have our own faith or fantasies about. My own particular belief is that when we die, that we move into a realm which is rather like the dream state. You see, when we dream in these bodies, we live in an alternative body. We have a dream body, all of us, when we dream. We have out-of-the-body experiences in our dreams. The materialists tell us that the whole thing's going on inside the brain, but since I think the brain's overrated, I don't take these theories too seriously. Of course, there may be brain correlations with dreaming, rapid eye movements, and so forth. But I think we may, in some sense, travel in our dreams. Out-of-the-body experiences and near-death experiences which involve a point of view, a consciousness separate from the body, may continue after death. And if they do, then the post-mortal state, the easiest way to imagine it for me, might be like being in a dream from which you can't wake up, because you no longer got a physical body to wake up into. Then, of course, what happens depends entirely on what you believe, what kind of person you are. Some people may go into a nightmare state that may be similar to visions of hell. Others may go into a continued sort of re-experiencing experiences of the kind you have in this life. I think that would be rather like purgatory. Some may, within the dream, sort of go into a kind of meditative state that leads into a transcendent or mystical realm, which some people approach in meditation during this life, which would be a kind of liberation or salvation. That's my own particular view. And for me it makes sense because it starts from the analogy of what we know from experience, namely the existence of a separate existence in our dreams, and the possibility of a continued existence after death. I think a lot of traditional religious doctrines can be interpreted in those kinds of terms. Of course, if you have a belief that when you die it all goes blank, maybe that's what will happen. There's a great deal of self-fulfilling prophecy, I think, when we are no longer constrained by the limits of the nervous system and serotonin levels and that kind of thing. But I think the mind is much greater than the brain, even when we're alive. So, I mean, that's my own view. I'm sure Terrance and Ralph will disagree. But it's a view on which probably everyone in this room has their own view. Do you have a view on this subject, Ralph?
Well, I would certainly hope to have an afterlife even if I didn't believe in it.
And finally, a couple clips on science and skepticism. These guys have quite a lot to say about this topic. Interestingly enough, Terrance McKenna sounds very much like a skeptic and a hard-liner in a lot of ways. And I think, again, as history plays out, you'll see how that position, in my opinion, doesn't hold up very well in time. And in the 15 years since then, we can see how skepticism and atheism has really played out more along the lines that Sheldrake anticipated. Although, I gotta say, I don't think any of these parties truly appreciated just how stuck in a rut we would continue to be for the next 15 years. Here goes.
So first, let me talk a little bit about how I see science. If any one of us were to take what is called a scientific approach to many of the phenomena that interest us, of psychic pets, the source of the content of the psychedelic experience, etc., etc., if we were to take a hard scientific view of these things, these phenomena, which we know exist and which we find rich in implications, would simply not be allowed as objects of discourse. They would be ruled out of order. So there's something wrong on one level with scientific, what's called empiricism, skepticism, positivism. It has different names. On the other hand, if we go to the other end of the spectrum and are willing to admit the testimony of iridologists, crop circle enthusiasts, victims of alien abduction, those who channel Atlantis, those who suspect undetected planets, those who believe. So I see then this problem. Science is too tight-fisted. It misses much of what is interesting. To abandon the approach of science is to just be without rudder in an ocean of strident claims and counterclaims, many of which are preposterous and certainly not all of which can be true.
I've certainly got a lot to say about all that. Very interesting. I think that first of all, we have to see that there's a regional problem here, that skepticism and Ockhamism and so on occur in different social balances in different parts of the world. You live in Hawaii and visit places like Maui quite frequently. Ralph lives right here in Santa Cruz, California, where you only have to mention the name to anyone in England who knows California at all, and they immediately say, oh yeah, where all the old hippies hang out. And it's a totally alternative place, and as we've seen in our joint appearances in Santa Cruz, there's a level of weirdness among some of the theories people have and the crank obsessions they follow, which from outside the perspective of the West Coast, most people would recognize as typically Californian. There's a kind of level of weirdness and cults and these, most of the phenomena you've named are phenomena of Hawaii and California. When you live in England, things take on a rather different perspective. There's a general level of popular skepticism, such as that the general tone of an English pub is one of sort of skepticism.
All that aren't crop circles and Graham Hancock, all homegrown British phenomena.
They are, but every single one of them in any single pub where it's debated would always have skeptics in the discussion. You're never going to have a kind of thing where you have all believers, except in small crank societies of true believers, which exist. But the thing is, the general cultural tone is one of skepticism. And so the need for a great deal more of skepticism doesn't feel quite so urgent if you live in London as it does if you live in Hawaii or California. That's my first point. But secondly, I think that the scientific skepticism you talk about is indeed a serious threat, and I think that's done more than anything to drive science in this direction. It's a kind of dogmatic skepticism that rules out at any cost weird phenomena like telepathy, non-locality, etc. And so to rule those out, you have to say that a lot of phenomena don't really exist, like telepathy and stuff, and if non-locality happens, it's just a peculiarity of the details of quantum theory with no wider
statistical anomaly gets rid of all problems.
So you can take these points of view, but the skeptical, those kind of dogmatic skeptics who I find myself confronted with quite often, the skeptical inquirer crowd, who are on my case whenever they can be, because they've classified me with the pro bono proptologists from distant star systems. So the thing is, I've had the experience of being put in that category by skeptics, including the editor of Nature. And there are skeptics in Britain who regularly appear and good for a quote any time by the press. My old friend Professor Lewis Walcott, at any moment, and to any journalist, several times a year will say, can't take this kind of thing so seriously. And then last year when he said, but Professor Walcott, don't you think you should keep an open mind about some of these things? He says, not so open that your brain drops out. So that kind of skeptic has done a great deal to force science into this narrow thinking mold. It's forced the investigation of telepathy into more and more ridiculously detailed and unrealistic parapsychology lab experiments, seeking to provide the statistical proof of regularities. However, what I've found is with the staring experiments and with the psychic pet experiments, one can achieve results, positive results, which fit with all this normal statistical thing. They're repeatable, positive, they meet all these statistical criteria. They're not evanescent phenomena like human synchronicities. These are regularities of nature. So the old-style statistical approach can actually take us much further, I think. I'm using old-style statistical methods in my own research because I don't want to change both the content and the style at the same time. I want to show that by the old methods, these are valid criteria.
Well, that wraps up my little sampling of these fascinating dialogues between Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, Terrance McKenna, and Dr. Ralph Abram from back in 1989 and 1998. I hope you enjoyed them, and I'll be very interested to see what thoughts you have about how relevant some of these topics are to our present-day discussion, and in particular, how relevant some of these arguments are to where we're at in looking at these issues of consciousness and skepticism and science. Now, if you have any thoughts along those lines, the place to connect with us is through the Skeptiko website. That's at skeptiko.com, and there you'll find links to our forum, to the comment section of the website where you can add a comment directly, and also for the email and Facebook links to me. I have a number of interesting shows coming up. I'm fascinated in the way that the topics are emerging and taking me in different directions, and I look forward to exploring all of that with you in the coming year. I hope you'll stick around, and until next time, take care and bye for now.